Back training is the most complicated and complex of all body part programming. The back muscles themselves can and should be trained through a large variety of exercises. Vertical pulling movements to target the upper back and the lats specifically, horizontal rowing exercises to target the upper, middle, and lower back thickness, and hip hinges to target the entire posterior chain and the lumbar specifically. Deadlifts fall into this category, and they're also the #1 exercise for lifting the heaviest weight out of any hip hinge exercise. Sumo deadlifts actually being higher for many people, but when we're talking specifically about lifting heavy things up and putting them down, we're talking about sumo and conventional deadlifts. Doing these movements can be great for strength and power, and if you're a competitive powerlifter, you obviously need to perform at least one of these two variations. But they also come with the increased risk of wear and tear. They're also an extremely technical lift, and they're not something I personally recommend most people perform without impeccable form. They also place a higher recovery demand on the entire body. The exercises will make you pick and choose if they should be a priority in your training program. But now, what if your goal is bodybuilding? You don't care how strong you are, you just want to have the most fully developed and complete physique possible. In that case, the question is, do you need to do a hip hinge to, again, develop that posterior chain, as doing things like rows won't build that same musculature to the entire back, from the traps all the way down to the lower back, lumbar, glutes, and hamstrings. Full development of those muscle groups really comes down to hip hinges. But if you're a bodybuilder, the great thing is you don't need to do a conventional deadlift to develop these muscles. There are much more bodybuilding specific hip hinges in my opinion. Great examples are the stiff leg deadlift from the floor, or Romanian deadlifts done just below the knee level. I'm personally a huge fan of the RDL, so you'll probably hear me talk about that one a bit more. But mostly, I'm a fan of hip hinges that allow full stretch of the target muscle, as well as heavy loading and static contraction at the bottom of the movement. And while RDLs are generally thought of as a hamstring specific movement, don't sleep on them for back thickness. The lower back and even the upper back and the traps, they're heavily engaged on this exercise. And when you replace something like a conventional deadlift with something like an RDL or a stiff leg deadlift, you're taking your quads completely out of the movement, reducing your ability to lift as much weight. This also reduces the amount of fatigue that the exercise places on the entire body. It also allows you to be much more specific in the body parts that you're targeting during that session. By fully stretching the hamstrings in an RDL or a stiff leg deadlift, you're getting much more direct work for them. And doing these movements, you're actually increasing the range of motion on the lower back by hinging more at the hips. You're now getting a greater range of motion for the entire posterior chain, as you're not just focused on powering that weight up off the floor like you would in a conventional deadlift. We've all seen guys who have massive backs who perform traditional deadlifts, but we've also seen the other guys who perform some seriously heavy weights on deadlifts, but they just don't have much muscle to show for it. There's plenty of guys in the 150 to 160 pound range that deadlift over 500 pounds. Some of these guys, unfortunately, don't even look like they lift. But most of the time, we're talking about powerlifters specifically. So muscle gain, it's not their primary goal. But it just shows you that you can use so many muscle groups to lift a barbell off the floor, that doing it in a conventional manner is not necessarily the most hypertrophy specific exercise. But now, if you look at a bodybuilder who could perform those same weights or anywhere near it with a slow and controlled eccentric portion of that lift, isometrically loading the back in that stretched position, keeping that stress on the entire back and legs throughout the full range of motion, and you'll always see massive thickness to the backs and the legs on those bodybuilders. Again, call it a hamstring or lower body specific exercise, I'll still call it a full body thickness movement. And although I might personally perform it on lower body days, there's also plenty of cases where I'll perform them on a back day. Or another thing I like to do is perform them on an additional day, specifically for thickness. The bottom line, a hip hinge isn't something I would skip out if your goal is a fully developed physique, but it doesn't have to be a conventional deadlift. And if your goal is mass, hip hinges should definitely be in your program. And if you want the workouts that I recommend to build muscle using proven old school bodybuilding methods, all of my old school mass gain programs are down below. And as always, if you want to see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.